Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Channel Survey. Let's take a few minutes and talk about the Starlink Mini briefly. I've been getting a lot of questions and stuff about that. You guys all know I've got Starlink on my boat. I used it on my Alaska trip and it was fantastic. So without any further ado, let's get started.
Close your eyes, hear the voice within, calling.
I'm not a big fan of the Starlink Mini for several reasons. So I do a lot of work from boat. When we did my Alaska trip, I actually worked from boat 3 days a week, on that trip. So I've got Cellular on the boat, I've got Starlink on the boat. So what's the Starlink Mini? Well, the big attraction of Starlink Mini is, first off, it's small. That's a huge attraction to it. The power draw on it is less. That's another big attraction to it. When it first came out, they were offering a $50 a month 50 gig plan, which was attractive. And it's powered off a 12 volt. All those things are great selling points for it. So it looks like so the dish I have is the Gen 2 is what we call it. It's the original RV dish that has the actuators on it. I've had it for several years. So it's not hard today to convert the Gen 2 or even the new Gen 3 dish, which is a little bigger than the RV dish, but it's got the kickstand, over to 12 volt, right? So they make a 168 watt DC-DC converter that goes from 12 to 56 volts, not the 12 to 48 that we've been using for a while. And then there's another little silver box. Here's a picture of what it looks like. That does all the network wiring and stuff. So it turns out there's only generally one network jack that I have to crimp, and that's for inside the cockpit. I take the Starlink cable, I cut it to length, crimp an RJ45 on that waterproof connector, and then it just twists on in the cockpit and it becomes easy to use. So the Starlink Mini, here's what I don't like about the Mini. First off, the small surface area of it. Where are you going to mount it, right? I've had a lot of people ask me, can you just mount it like in the V-berth window looking up? I'm like, well, it needs clear view of the sky. It has less surface area to get clear view of the sky. So if you put it like in the V-berth window looking up, the whole cockpit right here is all going to block signal to some degree, right? So not a big fan of it there. The other thing is it's power-wise, it's 12 to 40 watts. The Gen 2 dish I run is like 35 to 50 watts when I run it. And I'll give you this story. There's a couple stories to go with this. So I was in Petersburg, Alaska, working on the dock. That was the one area that Starlink kind of struggled a little bit. I mean, I had connectivity, but I would actually see, looking at the app that Starlink has, where the satellites would leave the field of view before another one came into the field of view. And that's with a much bigger dish. This Mini is going to struggle even more with that. And this has to do with the location of Petersburg, the big fjords and mountains on both sides of it. And there's less satellites the further north you go. So if anybody's used a Mini up in Petersburg, North Alaska, I'd really like to hear from how well it's worked for you up there. And that was a concern that I had. Outside of Petersburg, the Gen 2 dish worked great for us. If I had to do it all over again, what dish would I buy? I would buy the Gen 3, right? It's a little bit bigger dish. It's got the kickstand on it. Why do I like that? Because it's waterproof. Then I could permanently mount it on the back of the boat. I still wouldn't run it all the time. We never run Starlink when we're in motion underway. And that's where I use Cellular. And let me talk about Cellular versus having Starlink. You say, well, just run the Mini and then you just leave it on all the time. It doesn't pull, a lot of power. Well, 20 to 40 watts is a lot of power when you run that 24/7, right? Even if you just run it all throughout the day. So inside the Mini is got a built-in modem, right? That's the router that it uses to communicate. That's what you connect to for wireless, okay? The RV dish it's called the Gen 2 and the Gen 3, the router is external. That router is at home in my garage. I've never used it, right? Because I've got my Peplink cellular router right up there. And you may say, well, why do you need that? Because my cell antenna on top of the boat connects to that. And most of the time I run cellular. And you may think, gee, Martin, you're crazy running cellular. Why not just run Starlink and save some money? Well, Starlink on any of the dishes doesn't work in a covered slip. And I had a covered slip for many years, a metal roof on top. Wouldn't work in a boathouse. It's not going to work around a lot of trees and stuff either. And one other example, last August, we were at Kingston with a yacht club on a cruise and went to bed at 9 o'clock. Like, let me go watch some YouTube. And I'd already paid for Starlink for the month for the traveling I'd done in previous weeks. So I thought, I'll throw the Starlink dish out. I couldn't stream YouTube. It was less than a megabit of throughput, right? The area we're in the Puget Sound is oversaturated. And I ended up turning the dish off, going back to cellular to watch YouTube. And some friends of ours, they've got a 57-foot Bayliner. They've got the same Gen 2 dish for Starlink in their boat. They told me the next morning they couldn't watch YouTube that night either because there was no bandwidth left for Starlink. Right? Starlink, gives up any leftover bandwidth. That's what the roam plans get. So here I am in a major metropolitan area, and it didn't work, but cellular does. So, you got to look at the right tool, right job for the two. And for us,
have a backup.
Yeah, cellular is what we use most of the time. And when I'm underway, cellular is what I use. It's a waterproof antenna. And the other thing I like with the 42G mobility antenna I have is it's wireless also. So if I'm traveling with other boats, I can be in an anchorage. The boats can be 500 foot away. They can connect wireless from their boat to my boat and then ride Starlink back. So if you have the Mini, you can also run it off of an Ethernet cable and connect it to a router and then disable its internal router, right? The Mini does support that. The problem though is now on any mount you do for it, you're running two cables to it, not one. And that's another reason I like on the Gen 2 or the Gen 3. The install, I think, is easier on those dishes because you're running one network cable to it. Another thing, this kind of funny for me is with the network cable and crimping the RJ45 jack and the PoE power over Ethernet injector and all that. People always ask me, what is it I do for a living? I'm a network engineer. I've done networking for years. So Starlink routers, all that's right up my alley. And one of the problems I had early on channel surfing was I'd take my phone and I'd have to connect to the chart plotter Wi-Fi. I'd have to connect to I would have to connect to the Servo GX on Wi-Fi. I'd have to connect to my AIS on Wi-Fi. So I was always jumping around on all these SSIDs, and it was annoying to do that. With the boat router doing wireless, I walk on the boat, my phone connects to the router, and that router connects to cellular on the antenna with a SIM card. And if I plug Starlink in, then the router switches to Starlink and uses that instead of cellular. I disconnect Starlink, it goes back to cellular. My phone just connects wireless to one place. And the Servo GX connects to it, my AIS connects to it. It's one SSID. It's just like at home, right? Everything connects to the one thing. It just makes it a lot easier to work with and stuff. So that's the reasons that I'm not a big fan of the Mini. If you're portable, using it for backpacking, stuff like that, it looks like a great solution. But if all you're going to use it for is the boat, me personally, I would do the Gen 3 dish if I did it over again. And simply because it's waterproof and you can power it over PoE. The PoE injector, I'm actually redoing our website on the Starlink stuff, because the original PoE injector I had to build was very, I call it archaic. It's my Gen 1. It was all, not great parts off Amazon to build it, but they've gotten a lot better with the components. Now, like I said, it's just a 168 watt, 12 to 56 volt converter, and another little silver box, and you just buy pre-made network cables, click, click, so it goes from the router to the box. It goes from the box all the way out to where I put the jack in the cockpit, and then I mount the Starlink dish in the cockpit above the bimini so it has clear view of the entire sky. That way there's no shadow or anything like that on it. And Starlink, it works great on the boat. It was so instrumental for us getting up there. Another funny story on cellular, I'll share this just because we're talking about communications in general. So we're heading up to Alaska, and about a month before we left on the trip, my router actually broke. One of the frequencies stopped working, or where we connect and couldn't transmit. So I worked with Peplink, and they ended up RMAing it, and I had to send it back to them. And I didn't know when I was going to get another one. And I'm like, I'm leaving in 4 weeks. I need that router to work. So I bought a second one and had a spare on the boat. Well, sure enough, they RMA'd me a new one. So now I had two of them. And I went to Alaska, and the new one I put in the box, didn't use it. Just kept it on board as a spare and ran with it. And I would be texting a buddy of mine named Brian. Now, he did the Alaska trip the year before I did. And as we were traveling up through Alaska, all the way up there, I would text him pictures of the sea state out my window, crossing Cape Caution. We were in front of Tracy Arm. We were crossing the Dixon. These are places that you normally would not have cell service at all. And Brian knew where cell service wasn't, because he remembers his trip with how much he did and how little communication he had, for that. And he would pull me up on InReach and be like, I just got this text from Martin with photographs. And he's like, and he'd look at an InReach and be like, he shouldn't have cell coverage there. How's he doing it, right? So there's a big difference between what they call the cell phone boosters. That's not what I have, right? A cell phone booster is going to boost your voice and stuff. That Mobility 42G antenna, it's a high gain antenna, and it's got 4 cell antennas in it. It's got 2 wireless antennas and a GPS antenna. What it basically does is it takes that cellular signal that normally radiates in all directions. Think of it like a sphere going, right? So you only have so much power, and it's radiating it in all directions. There's no cell towers up in outer space. They're at the land. So take that signal and refocus it like a flashlight so that it goes 360 degrees around, and take the energy you have, but just concentrate it, shooting it towards shore. That's what that antenna does. And I was able to do some measurements with it. We were going into Glacier Bay, and Bartlett Cove would be the nearest cell tower that they had there. And I don't know where around Bartlett Cove that cell tower is, but I was halfway up Strawberry Island in Glacier Bay, which is 14 nautical miles north of Bartlett Cove, before I lost cell coverage texting Brian. So I was pretty impressed with that. And when I got back from the trip, Brian, and I were talking, and he was so convinced on cellular, he bought my spare off me. I was like, I don't need any more. I'm done with my Alaska trip for that year. So he, and he went and bought one of the Maritime 20G antennas from Peplink to pair up with it. So the key takeaway on this is cellular and Starlink, they're right tool, right job. There's no one size fits all. I wish there was. But cellular works great at Kingston. Starlink did not, and that's an oversubscription of service that Starlink has. And the further away from shore that I get, and the further off grid I go, then Starlink is going to obviously outperform what cellular would do and be fantastic, right? So you just got to look where you want to go. And I was actually looking this morning, and they actually offer the $50 plan for 50 gigs for the Gen 2 and the Gen 3 dishes now. Starlink's always changing their plans and stuff, so it's kind of tough to keep up with what's legit and what's not. The other thing too, and this is kind of a minor thing, the Starlink Mini maxes at 100 gig or 100 megabit down is the fastest it'll go. You can exceed 100 megabit on the Gen 2 or Gen 3 dish. Is that really that important? Personally, no. For as small as our boats are, I just can't imagine needing anything that would be faster than 100 meg. But there is a speed limitation difference between the Mini and the Gen 2 or Gen 3 dish. So, and because the Gen 2 and Gen 3 dishes are bigger, they cover a larger portion of the sky and will be less susceptible to the mountains and stuff like that, and they'll capture more satellites and get better coverage overall. So with that, if you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the comment section below, and thanks for watching.
If you enjoyed watching this video, click the screen to watch another.